Good morning. It's a bit of a grey, rainy day here at the office, so we're going to just answer Q&A on the veranda here. If you've got any beginner beekeeping questions, today is dedicated more so to beginner beekeeping. So there's no such thing as a silly question, and people have been emailing their questions through, which is fantastic. So we have some questions ready to go, but if you've got more questions, put them in the comments below and we'll get to answering them. Also, let us know whereabouts in the world you're tuning in from. It's really interesting to us. We do have flow hives in over 130 countries now, so that's pretty amazing to hear where you are in the world. So if you have a look here, we've got various different types of brood frames. Now that's one thing I wanted to show you. Now, when people are putting together their hive, it often comes up, what should we do in the brood box? Now, there's quite a number of different types of frames you can put together. So what we supply is this, which is a foundationless frame. And the reason why it's foundationless is because there's not this man-made wax foundation that's been put in, or the plastic foundation. We're simply allowing the bees to start from this comb guide here, which is a stick we put in the top, and that just gives them something to start and hang their wax on, and the bees will hang their wax down and start building out the frame from there. Here's an example. Once it's in the hive, here's some very fresh white wax where the bees have actually connected it to the comb guide, which is the stick in the top, and started to draw their wax down. Isn't it such a beautiful sight? When it's white like that, that's the fresh wax that the bees make for the first time. Now, if the wax has been used a lot, it starts to go yellow, and then if it's dark like this, that's when it has been used for the brood. So the bees put their silk, the bees spin a silk cocoon around themselves when they're going through their metamorphosis from the grub phase into a bee. And they emerge out of those cells, but each time they do that, the frame and the comb gets a little bit darker, so it's perfectly normal to see that. If you've got any questions, put them in the comments below. We're starting with beginner questions, no such thing as a silly question. So the idea is that we all start off as new beekeepers once. It doesn't matter what questions you ask. We're here to help answer them so that you can get a start in this fascinating world of beekeeping. Okay, we've got a few other frame types. That's a completely plastic foundation frame. Quite popular in commercial beekeeping. You can spin them really hard in a centrifuge. We don't need to do that with the flow hive because we have a way to extract honey directly out of the hive without having to go through that centrifuge process with the frames. I find the bees can ignore these for quite a long time. You will need a really strong flow and a lot of bees, and probably some strategic placement to get them to use this kind of frame, in my opinion. I've got some on the edge of one hive, and it's been in there for a couple of years now, and they still haven't used it. So you usually have to coat them in wax and really encourage the bees to use that kind. This is probably the most common way it's done, which is the wire, which you can see here. And you get a battery and some leads, and you heat up those wires and melt the foundation, which is just a foundation sheet, onto those wires, and the bees will then start from there. This is a 5.3 millimeter brood foundation, or it's sort of multi-purpose. Bees will generally make a slightly smaller cell for themselves and a larger cell for storing honey. If you take a look at this, the bees are just making the cells as they like them, and I believe there's a health benefit in the bees being able to size the cells for themselves. So I like to keep it perfectly natural in the brood box and let the bees do their thing. Okay, questions?
We have a question from Rob. He says, "Hi Cedar, I have large honeycomb in the roof of my flow hive. It's stuck to the inner cover and hive lid, and it must be really big as it's very heavy to lift the hive roof. Any suggestions as to how to remove the comb, or is it best to leave it alone for winter food? Many thanks, Rob."
Okay, great question. So in the top of the hive, if you have a look at this one here, you'll notice there's a hole in the inner cover. Now, what Rob's talking about is the bees, he hasn't got a plug or some kind of cover here, and the bees are free to go up into this roof cavity. And what you'll find is the bees will just build a whole lot of natural comb in this area that's full of honey. They tend to keep their brood down in the bottom. So you'll find that this just gets filled up with comb, which can be wonderful, especially if you're new to beekeeping and you really want to see that and cut up some of that comb and share it around at a party or something. But it's also can be quite messy, so I tend to put the plug in, and that way this area stays free from comb. But if you the best way to deal with it, if it is full of comb, is to gently lever it off. The comb will break, and then it's a case of getting the bees out of it. Now, while you're beekeeping, you might just put that to the side. A lot of bees will fly off back to the hive, and the remaining ones you'll have to brush out with some foliage or a brush, and then you can take that away. You can put a temporary cover over this, and you can take that back to the kitchen, cut up that comb and put it into some containers to keep. Now, the containers have to be well sealed with honey, because honey tends to absorb moisture, and if the moisture's too high, it'll start to ferment. So you can put it in those typical plastic takeaway containers if you want to, but they don't seal that well, so you'll need to keep them in the fridge if you're keeping that comb. And then you might choose to scrape off the rest of the comb here and cover this. You can even just put if you don't have one of these plugs, you can just put a wood over it, or anything suffice to stop the bees getting up into this area. Great question.
We have another one that came in via email from Mike. He was wondering what to do with ants around the hive that are wanting to get into the bottom board, as well as at the back of the hive where the honey flows out. He also has some honey sitting in the bottom of the super frames. Should he clean that out before the next harvest if the bees don't eat it before then?
Okay, so first question, ants. Now, if you've got the flow hive too, one thing you can do is extend your legs by simply lifting it like this and winding out those legs like that, and that'll give you a bit of space to work with. And when you've got a bit of the bolt showing, then you can put some white Vaseline on that, and that will slow those ants down. It tends to work quite well, but of course you need to get your foliage away from the hive, because the ants will simply walk up the foliage and onto the hive. So you'll have to clear away any beautiful plants you've planted around your hive, so that the ants can't just walk onto the hive. Now, I'll just spin this around. The next question was about honey in the bottom of the frames. So it's quite normal to get a bit of build up in the bottom of the flow frames. Here's the flow frames, my father and I's invention, and in the bottom here, depending on how well the bees seal all the parts together, you can get some drips of honey building up in this area. Now, sometimes just turning the cap around, just grabbing it and giving it a spin, is enough to break the wax down here at this, what we call the leak back point. We designed that so that any remaining honey after harvesting can just go back into the hive for the bees to reuse. so there's a little gap there. But the bees, being bees, will block that area up. So we also designed it so each time you harvest, there's a little tongue on the tube which unblocks that area for you without having to think about it, so the remaining drips will go back into the hive. So you can either poke one of the tubes into that area to unblock it and wipe up any honey that's dribbled onto here, put the cap back in, or you can use the end of your flow key, or you can use a stick or anything just to clear that area, put your cap back in, and that honey will drain back into the hive. If you're in a humid area and the honey's been in there for a long time, it may be better to insert a tube and just drain that into a jar, because if it's been sitting there a long time, it may ferment if it's in a humid climate. So rather than letting that go back to the bees, you might want to take that away. Great question.
Ashley has a Hive Classic, so doesn't have an inner cover with the plug. What do you suggest she uses to cover the hole?
So any piece of wood will do. If you let's just have a look at that again. Take the roof off. So any piece of wood will do. Just sit it on top like that. The bees aren't strong enough to push that up. Now, obviously you need that for your rear window and for your shelf, so you wouldn't use that particular piece, but anything you've got lying around you can put on there if you don't have one of these.
Michael says, Cedar, I love the Flow 7. In Ascot, Brisbane, he says all systems there were firing very well in October and the super was filling up. But then the bees swarmed and the hive wasn't overly full once the super went on. Then it swarmed again 3 days later. New queen is laying, but now he's concerned about filling neighbours' garages up with the bees again. Is it better to remove the queen and swarm cells?
Yeah.
And lastly, should he add a second brood box or just have another flow hive on hand?
Okay, so sometimes you can get genetics that are quite swarmy, and we've had that here. They can be great if you want to build up bees really quickly, but it can be quite annoying in a suburban environment where your bees are taking off into your neighbour's yard. So there's a few things you can do. Yes, some management practice, a lot of beekeepers do suggest getting in there and breaking off the queen cells. It's a bit more advanced. If you don't know what you're doing there, I wouldn't suggest going in there and cutting off all the queen cells, because the hive may be producing them for a supersedure cell, for instance, and you might get into the situation where you raise another queen. So I'll just show you what a queen cell looks like. We don't really have a queen cell, but we have a queen cup, which is the start of one. So if you look at this frame here, what you've got is the start of a queen cell. Now it hangs down a bit like a peanut shell. So some beekeepers will buy a queen from a breeder, and then they'll get in there and they'll cut off any queen cells because they don't want her to be superseded. And that, while that will limit swarming as well, it's a little more advanced, and the best thing to do is probably give your bees some more room as they get crowded. So if you look in the windows and it's hard to see the flow frames because there's so many bees, and particularly in the springtime, that is when they're more likely to swarm. Sometimes you get a little late swarm. Sometimes a hive, as you say, will swarm twice, and it's simply because they've raised a number of queens, and there's another one ready to go. But you also get hives that'll go for years without swarming as well. So it does depend on your genetics, but the thing to do to manage that is make sure they have enough space. My preferred method is to take a split as the bees get quite, as the bees build up, and especially if you've left it a bit late, the bees will start to build up at the entrance and hang down in a bit of a beard. You want to get straight in there take out half the brood frames and put them into another box. That will alleviate that pressure of not having enough room. If you add a second brood box, that will also, or even a second honey super, that will also give them a bigger hive, and they'll be less swarmy, less likely to swarm. Great question.
Helga has a question about the frame that you're holding right now. When the wax goes to dark brown, should you swap it out or just leave it alone?
It goes dark brown quite quickly after a number of brood cycles. This one could perhaps, at a guess, it's been in the hive for 4 months and it's already quite brown. Generally, beekeepers will swap them out once they get even darker and older. Usually you want to keep them in the hive for not more than a couple of years. So beekeepers will be cycling them towards the edge of the hive, letting any brood emerge. Typically they'll keep honey on the edges, and then you can swap that out for a new one and eat or crush and strain the honey that's in the edge frame. And that way you've got a new cycle. If you're using foundationless like this, you don't even need another frame. You can just wander out to the hive, grab a knife and just cut the wax out just by running it around here. It'll fall out into your tray. An oven tray or something like that is useful, and then you can put it straight back in. The bees will build some nice fresh wax. It's another advantage of using foundationless frames.
Sabrina's from Virginia and is asking, how long does it take for bees to build comb on the foundationless frames? Are you looking at days or weeks?
Okay, the answer, like many things in beekeeping, is it depends. So what she's talking about is how long does it take for the bees to start from this, start building their comb and end up with this. So if you've hived a big swarm, let's say there's a big swarm that's hanging down like a 3 footballs worth of bees hanging off a branch, and there's lots of forage around, you'll usually find they'll fill up the box in just a few days with beautiful comb ready to go. That's because the bees are in a hurry at that point. They have no home yet. They need to create the structure with this beautiful wax. So if you've got a weaker colony, not many bees, or it's a small swarm, or there's not much forage around for them to bring in that nectar they need, then it can take a long time, and you can even get a situation where you've had a brood box all season and they still haven't completed all of the frames. So it depends on the strength of the colony and how much nectar there is available for them to turn into wax.
Alex would like to know, how does the natural foundation work with the flow hive mechanism?
So the answer is it doesn't. In the bottom box here, you'll see that it's simply those wooden frames, which you can have the natural foundation, or you can put in plastic foundation or plastic frames, whatever you like. But that's pretty much the way conventional beekeeping has been done for a very long time. The flow frames, however, if I turn this around, are something very different. So your bees are doing their thing in the bottom box, as they always have been. When they've filled up that area, getting busy, they'll come up into this area and start filling the flow frames with honey, covering them all in wax and building the frames out further. And that is, so you can have any kind of honey box as well. You could have a conventional honey box. You could use naturally drawn combs just with the comb guide and squeeze the honey out with your hands if you want to. But our invention allows you to tap it off in the way that you've seen, simply by turning the key and watching the honey flow out into your jar. It doesn't need any further processing, and it has one surprise for us is the the floral notes and the flavour retention is more so than I've experienced in any other type of extracting honey. And it's simply because the only thing that's made the honey go from in the frames to in your jar is gravity. It's just flowing out of the hive, that it doesn't touch any metal surfaces, it doesn't mix with any other honeys from other frames, and you get that beautiful flavour retention.
Russell's had hives for 2 years now, and both years they've swarmed. He's joined a bee club and has been mentored with traditional hive learning and cannot figure out why they swarm from the 2 flow hives. Any ideas?
Okay, so again, I'd say it's genetics. So there's a few things that can happen. You can get swarming, you can get absconding. Absconding is where the whole colony leaves. Now they usually do that if the hive beetles have taken over and the bees have decided that it's no use trying to preserve this home, and they'll go and make a new one. But swarming is where they've gotten nice and busy, they're healthy, they've built up their numbers. The old queen leaves with half of the bees, and a new queen is raised for the other half of the bees that are left behind. So to me, it's genetics, and we've had some genetics here. One of our staff brought in a strain of bee that they loved. It was very swarmy. It would build up and take flight before it had even finished the flow super, which I found a bit annoying. Generally, the bees will fill their hive completely and really build up before they go. Each time they swarm, you do get some new genetics because they raise a new queen, so they've got half of the same genetics, but then they've got a whole lot of new genetic material from drones in the area coming in that she mates with on a mating flight. So hopefully you get better luck next time. The hive is a conventional beehive in the bottom, so there really shouldn't be any difference between the flow hive and conventional. Keep trying, and as so many thousands of customers that we have, hopefully you get some honey stored in your flow frames this next time around.
Asher lives in Grafton, New South Wales, and has a hybrid flow hive. The nuke was picked up in December, but the bees are struggling with a lack of natural food source. So she's been supplementing them since the last week in December using sugar water, dry pollen, and a combination of pollen and sugar water, but they don't seem to be growing in numbers. There were 5 frames in the nuke, and she added 2 new frames of wax, but they haven't seemed to want to bother with them. Any advice on how to help them start building the hive in numbers, but more importantly, what do I do for winter as there are no honey stores at all?
So you can get a colony that is quite slow, and it's also affected by the surrounding environment. So there's many factors here, and the 2 things you need to get growth are good genetics, a good laying queen, and a nectar flow around. In many parts of the country it's still very dry. We're so lucky to have some rain here. We've had a lot of fires, a lot of foliage loss, and that's going to take a long time to recover. But here it has been a very poor season as well. The dry meant that a lot of flowers just didn't produce any nectar, and a lot of species didn't nectar at all. And so what that means for bees is there's just not enough really to expand. Now our bees are doing okay here, but they're not really putting on any more stores of honey. So they're just managing to maintain, not adding or not subtracting. In other areas you might find that they're actually shrinking as they eat their honey stores. If you find that's the case, as you said, feeding them is a great idea to keep them going. Now, as to your question of getting through winter, what area did you say again, Leah?
Grafton.
Grafton. So in Grafton we don't have a long cold winter, so your bees should be fine to survive without a huge amount of stores. it won't be necessary in that area to feed them up to the point you would if you're in the southern parts of Australia or the northern parts of Europe or America. So you'll find that if you just keep nursing them along, keep feeding them, eventually you might even find there's an autumn flow with the rains that have just come, and the bees will start to build some more comb and build out from there. If they don't, then you might find you need to replace the queen to more virile genetics of a hive that's and a queen that's laying more eggs and a colony that's expanding. Let us know how you go.
We've got a question from Mick, who's in Mullaney. Mick has a flow Hive Classic and wants to know, should the core flute slider be kept in place at all times? As there are 2 slots to insert the slider, which one is preferred and why?
Okay, so I don't have an example of that right here, but basically in our Classic, which we we still have those available today. There's a core flute slider which has 2 slots now. The bottom slot is for allowing ventilation, also counting varroa mites when you're in a continent that has varroa mites, and the top slot puts the core flute slider right up against the screen. Now the reason why we put that slot there is when you're harvesting, if there's any honey that spills within the hive, like there sometimes is, it'll be caught on the screen area and the bees can just lick that up through the screen. So when you go to harvest, put it in the top slot. If you got it up on a bit of a stand, have a little look under there, make sure there's not a whole lot of bees while you put that slider in place. You can leave it just in the top position if you want to. If you leave it there for a very long time, what you'll find is the bees will connect it with propolis and wax to the screen, and it will be hard to remove, and it becomes more like a solid bottom board. So there's a few options there. Generally we recommend keeping it in the bottom slot, and then when you go to harvest, move it to the top.
Ashley would like to know, with all of the fires that have happened, how has it affected our hives or our bees? So
right here we've been lucky. We live in an area that you can see it's very green now, and we have had some rains, which is fantastic, and that will set off some more flowers as we're in the remaining part of summer and autumn, which will be great for the bees. They're even in areas with fire, as long as they've still got some forest within 3 kilometres that's flowering, or in suburban areas where people plant a lot of things, then the bees are okay in this area. Stone Behind a Camera has hives right in the area we were firefighting. Half the team was out here firefighting, and the whole mountainside burnt, but the other side of the mountain still hasn't burnt, and his bees were able to keep foraging and keep bringing in nectar even through the times that were really smoky. So bees are incredibly resilient, incredibly resourceful, and they can also fly up to 10 kilometres if they're really hungry. Other areas are not so fortunate. If you look on the maps, you can see the areas that have been burnt, and we've lost more forest to fire here in Australia than any other country in the world, more than the Amazon fires by a long shot. And that's really sad. If you're in one of those areas, it will take a while for the flowers to come back again. But with the rains that will hopefully come, that the area will recover. If you're in one of those areas, you may need to feed the bees. If you type into our Facebook live feed about how to make a simple feeder that goes in the roof, you'll find some examples there of some simple feeders you can make to keep your hive going until more flowers start to bloom.
Rhonda has found that her girls don't seem to like capping one of the outside flow frames. Is it okay to move that frame into the centre to get them to cap it? Or do I just leave it and wait? She's harvested all of the other frames twice, but not that one.
Okay, so one of the frames on the outer edge, if you look in this window here, isn't being finished with honey. So by all means, you can move it in. You can move the move of one that's already waxed up to the edge, and that will speed up that last one. Bees will be bees, and every colony is a little bit different. You'll find that bees will fill from the centre out, so they'll start storing in the middle more so, and move out to the extremities of the hive, to the front and rear of the frames, and to the edges. So another thing you can do is just wait till they've filled up all the frames and let them finish the very last one. Up to you. It probably doesn't matter a great deal if you're getting some nice harvests anyway.
Rhonda also says, Cedar, which idea is better when the hive needs more space? Is it better to add 2 supers or 2 flows, or 2 brood boxes?
The answer is you can do either. Some people like to run a double brood. I like to keep it a single brood. I find if you count up all the cells in the brood box, there's plenty enough for a queen to lay in. I find if you put a second brood box, you end up with the brood mainly in the bottom box and a little bit in the middle of the top one, and the rest honey. And then you've got a whole lot of frames you need to process in some way. So I'd recommend either, if you do want to add another box, you can add another super, and that could be a conventional one for collecting honey if you want to, collecting honeycomb if you want to, or another one of our flow boxes if you're enjoying tapping the honey off straight out of the hive.
Caroline's asking, what's the best time of year to install and establish a new hive? She's in Brisbane.
Okay, so in the Brisbane area, it's a subtropical region, and while you can start colonies all year round, the very best time in just about anywhere in the world is the springtime, where that's when most flowers bloom. You've got an abundance of blossom, and the bees can really bring all that nectar back into the hive and use it to build their comb and expand. And when they've got an abundance of nectar and pollen, they use about 1 whole frame of honey and 1 frame of pollen to raise 1 frame of brood. So they do need to collect a fair bit, and that's why a colony can visit 50 million flowers in a day.
Dylan harvested from his flow hive and said sometimes there will be 2 different coloured honeys running into his container, and when it settles there seems to be a dominant colour sitting on top. Have you noticed honey like this? And is it possible that this honey from the same source, one can crystallise more easier than the other?
The answer is yes and yes. So while bees will often start in one area and move to the next frame and to the next frame, you get honeys in different frames, which is fantastic. You can also get the situation where they've changed forage sources in the one frame, and you might get a really dark honey and a light honey in the one frame, and you'll see them swirling together in your jar. It's quite fascinating to watch. And those honeys can be a different density also, and that's why one can float on top of the other as it settles into, and then you get this 2-tone kind of thing going on in your jar where you've got a light and a dark on top of one another. So the next part of the question was?
The next part of the question is, have you noticed honey like this, and does it crystallise more easier than one honey from all the same source?
The answer is it depends. So it just depends what the bees have been foraging on. The different ratios of sugars in your honey will determine whether it will crystallise more quickly or not. So if you get the melaleuca or the paperbark here, you find it'll crystallise very quickly, sometimes even crystallise in the hive. If it's sitting there in the winter on the edge of the hive and it gets cooler, you can get some candied honey in the frame, which means it will be less of that honey will flow out at the time. So it really depends on the nectar source as to how quick it will candy. Now, we find in this area there's not really any issues with candied honeys. It was a question that came up a lot in the beginning, but we really don't get much feedback of people having issues with honey candying in the hive. Even the canola or rapeseed is one that beekeepers often struggle with. They pull the box off the hive, and on the way to the processing shed in the conventional way, it starts to candy. Whereas if you're harvesting it directly out of the hive, it's still maintained at a higher temperature, simply because the bees like to keep their brood warm. And if you can get that honey off before it candies, you can be a step ahead.
Danny is in North Carolina and would like to know if it's a good idea to plant flowers for butterflies and pollinators near the hives. He's getting 2 nukes next month and just wants to help the bees and the pollinators.
The answer is always, it's a great idea to plant anything that's flowering, and it will help pollinators. Now, in terms of a honey crop, you need to plant many acres of flowers in order to actually get to change how much honey stores you'll get in your flow hive. So you're doing it for reasons of supporting a lot of the native pollinators, and also for the beautiful aesthetic and the learning that it can have with your family as you watch all different species, not only the European honeybee, but a lot of native species that have a really small foraging area. Now, it's really helpful for those. They may only have a radius of a few hundred meters that they'll forage in. So you planting flowers might give them the stepping stone to then move further afield. And when you have those stepping stones, particularly across the urban landscape, you're allowing some of those species to survive and spread, and it might just be what helps some of those species from the brink of extinction. So if all of us can plant enough forage and create that habitat for all of our native bee species, then we're more likely to be able to keep them, and they all form a part of a really important network of pollination that we completely rely on.
We have a great question from Scott, who's in Brisbane. He's just populated his new flow hive 2 with bees and is wondering, do you leave the hive level, or is it okay to have it set on the 2.5 degree slope all the time?
Okay, a great question. So it's important with a flow hive that you have a slope towards where you're harvesting your honey. Now, I prefer to harvest the honey at the rear of the hive because the bees are at the entrance, and you'll often find you'll be there harvesting honey and the bees don't even notice what's going on. You can be there with your family, with your friends, harvesting that honey. Now, for that reason, you want this end to the rear of the hive, the opposite way around to it's positioned at the moment. But to get the honey to flow out, you need a little bit of a slope. So you want at least a 2.5 degree slope. With the flow hive 2, we've built levels into the side of the hive to show you what the correct slope should be. If you have a look at this level in the side, and if we lift the hive to about that 2.53 degree slope, you'll notice that level then sits in the middle. So that's the slope you want to have your hive on. Now, it's confused conventional beekeepers because it's conventional to tip your hive forward. And tipping your hive forward will cause some issues when you're harvesting. A lot of the honey won't come out and a lot will spill into the hive. So it's really important that it is tipped backwards. And I really recommend that the hive is on the slope backwards towards where you're harvesting all the time, because there's also honey that does drip through and go to that leak back point and back to the hive. So if you have it sloped the other way and you plan to just slope it when you're harvesting, you can get into a situation where that honey sits in the trough, but it won't actually get to that leak back point and go through that recirculating process of that any drips that come into this area. So that's why we recommend putting it on a backwards slope, and to get less water in the entrance, which is the reason why conventional beekeepers put the hive sloping forward, we've put a slope here. If you can see this metal here, so we get less water flowing in. We've also sloped the landing board, which you can see here, so any rain landing here runs off. Having said that, you do get a bit of water if you've got heavy rain splashing into the entrance, but we have a screened bottom board, so it'll just go through into your tray and doesn't actually form a puddle in your hive. So harvest at the back and slope the hive backwards on a 2.5 to 3 degree slope is ideal.
Christy Ann would like to know, what is the best time to get started beekeeping in Victoria?
So in Victoria is for those that don't know, it's the southern part of Australia here, and it is colder. You have a longer, colder winter. So while you could get going now, I'd recommend starting with a colony that's already fairly established if you plan to do that. We've got a little bit of summer left and then autumn. The very best time to get started is in the springtime, where you've got an abundance of nectar and pollen for your bees to get straight into. Another thing you can do is purchase a conventional hive that's already full of bees and simply swap them into your flow hive, and that way you can get a jump start on the season like that. And if you have an autumn flow, you might be lucky enough to catch some of that. If you're starting from a small colony, a nuke, then you may be better off starting when the spring flowers are blooming.
She'd also like to know, what is the smallest size property that you need to be able to beekeep?
Okay, so it's not so much about the size of your property, it's about what is around you and whether the bees can have access to flowers. You'll find many people keeping bees in urban areas, even on rooftops in the city. My sister keeps hives on a balcony in Berlin, so it has become quite popular to keep bees in those environments, and people in the cities often find that you get more of a variety of honey than you do in the countryside. So because people are planting all sorts of things in their garden, the bees have a lot of variety to forage on, and each type of flower has a different colour, a different flavour. So city beekeeping can be fantastic.
Vanessa had her first nuke disappear from her flow hive after 2 days. The second nuke she installed stayed for a year before disappearing in December when the fires were 2 kilometres away and there was very thick smoke. Can you give any suggestions to help making her bees stay? Her hive faces northeast and she's been supplementing with sugar syrup and has water sources available nearby.
It sounds like you're doing all the right things, and that's a bit of bad luck, and it's quite interesting. You can have one hive that really just goes and goes and is trouble free, and you can have another one that's just hard to get it to get to that productive space. And I always recommend having more than one hive, because you get to see the differences in your hives, and while one might be having a challenging time getting on its feet, another one might be just really pumping out the honey. So of course it does depend, and you've had the fires nearby which will slow things down, as they usually won't leave even when a fire is really close. So that's a bit of a shame that they have, and that's called absconding, if the colony just gets up and goes to fly to a new area. Perhaps you had very intelligent bees and they thought, this fire's too close, we're out of here. I'm not sure, but one tip would be start your colony with the brood box only, and that way they've got a box sized more closely to the size of their colony. If you have too much space in your hive when the colony's small, it might feel a bit overwhelming for the bees, especially in times when there's not a whole lot of nectar and the colony's quite small. So start with a small box, and you've just basically got a hive that's the same as any conventional hive, and not until you have all the frames really built out and lots of bees in your bottom box put your super on top. So perhaps you're doing that already, and it sounds like you're doing everything right. I would perhaps say better luck next time. Hang in there. It's amazing when you get to that point of a really productive hive, and if you persist, you certainly will.
Have we got time for 2 more questions?
We've got time for a couple more questions.
Lewis is asking, is it better to add the conventional super box on top of the flow hive super or in the middle?
Okay, that's a great question, and the answer, like most things in beekeeping, is it depends. So the question is, if you're adding another conventional super box, so a box with just some conventional frames in it to collect some comb, or perhaps you're doing it for another reason, would you put it in between these 2 boxes or on top? Now, if you're drawing natural comb, then the answer is quite different, because if you put naturally drawn comb like these comb guides, like we're doing here, then what you'll find if you just put it on top is that bees might start from the bottom and work their way up, and you end up with a whole lot of wonky, messy comb, which is really hard to service. It is a requirement that you can remove frames to service your hive, and if it gets all messy, you'll need to fix that up so that you can remove frames. So for that reason, if you're putting a box on top, then I would recommend putting some foundation in, or you can move half of the frames up from your bottom box and put one that's fully drawn next to one that's not. So either foundation like this, wax and wire in the top, and that will keep the bees nice and straight, or if you move half of the frames up, make sure the queen stays down the bottom below the excluder, and you'd do one that was nice and straight, another one that's empty, another one that was nice and straight, all the way across the box. The nurse bees will come up and finish raising any brood, and then you'll have a box full of hopefully nice and straight comb. Another option you have is you can put it underneath all of the boxes, and the bees being in this box will work their way down to your new one, and that way you will get some straight comb as they hang from this comb guide downwards. So if you just want to start with a fresh lot of foundationless frames, go right underneath all of your boxes, wait till they're drawn out before you move that box upwards. As far as putting it above or below the flow box, the answer is it doesn't matter. Beekeepers tend to under super, and that is because under super, which is putting your box underneath the top one, so in between these 2, and that is because bees like to keep their honey further away from the brood nest. So if you put 2 boxes, they'll tend to start storing they'll tend to start moving honey from one to the other, so under supering can be slightly more of an efficient way to go. But each beekeeper will have a different opinion on this, so ask around as well. The answer really is it doesn't matter unless you've got naturally drawn comb, and then you need to think about that. One more question.
Donna Lynn's asking, if your colony is small and you wanted to get more bees to help build them up, how would you go about adding them to the existing colony, or will they try and kill them?
Okay, generally you don't add bees to your existing colony unless you're in a situation where you've got a failed hive, you haven't managed to introduce a new queen and you want to save those remaining bees, and then you go through what's called a merging process, where you put some newspaper on your hive that does have its queen on the top here, and put the new colony on top and let them chew their way through that newspaper, and they get used to the smell in the meantime, and their colonies are then merged. However, if you want to add brood from another hive, you could do that to boost that colony and get it going. So you'd shake all the bees off, give it a good shake all the bees off, choose some frames that have plenty of capped brood on them, put that into your weaker hive, and that'll give them a bit of a boost. Best thing to do is probably let them expand themselves, and if the queen isn't virile enough to lay enough eggs, or you don't have enough forage, it might be either a patience game or replacing the queen to really get them going. So some great questions. Thank you very much, and tune in again next week if you've got something you'd really like us to cover. We're here to answer your questions and get you started in the fascinating world of beekeeping. So put those questions in the comments below and we'll keep answering them, and also save some of them up for our next live broadcast. See you again next week.